There's a dwarf person who is half the height of mine, and he sees a bird doing a pole vault and entering the room through a window. The reason behind it is because he had his friend, the nightingale, who was lying dead, and he wanted to save his life, so he called an ambulance. Before we get into the video, I want you people to know how to solve a Rubik's Cube blindfolded, and if you don't know how to do one, I have a tutorial on it. Check in the description box down below. Hey guys, I hope you all are doing good. I'm Immortal Knight here, and in this video I'll be teaching you how you can solve multiple Rubik's Cube blindfolded. There are many people who say that when you solve multiple Rubik's Cube blindfolded, unlike single Rubik's Cube, you need to know many different algorithms, you need to use a completely different method and all those weird stuffs. Well, the simple answer to it is obviously no. Say if I ask you to solve 3 Rubik's Cube, will you solve each one of them with a different method, or will you continue using the same method you used to solve a single Rubik's Cube? The answer obviously is you'll be using the same method, say CFOP, Ruse, ZZ, or even beginner's method. The same applies for multiplind. No matter what method you use, say old Pokemon, M2, Roscoe, 3 style, you just need to use the same method over and over again for different cubes. So if you're attempting for 10 cubes multiplind, you need to do 3 style on 10 different cubes but with different move sets in it. Okay, so with that out of the way, I'm gonna quickly let you guys know how you can memorize several different cubes. So when you're going for a single 3 blind solve, normally you would use audio for edges and images for corners. And the reason behind it is because once you memorize audio for edges, you can straight away go into execution for the edges. And the way you memorize the images for corners need not necessarily be connected to each other. They just need to be images out of the 2 letters that you memorized. And here's where the main difference comes into play. When you're solving multiple cubes blindfolded, the way you memorize stuffs is more important than the way you execute the stuffs. If you use audio for edges and images for corners that have no link with each other, it's gonna become really hard for you to continue memorizing other cubes, as you will tend to forget the cubes that you memorized at the beginning of your memorization process. So here is where all the speed cubers use a method called as the memory palace, the Roman rooms, the method of loci, the journey method. Essentially all these methods refer to the same thing. In this technique we use our spatial memory. And what do I mean by spatial memory? Well, I don't want to get too complicated, and in simple words, it is just using locations that you're super familiar with, and even if I ask you to blindfold yourself and walk around in a specific room, say if that room is in your home or you just have some very other distinct place in your mind, you won't crash into a single object. So let us say I ask you to remember a ninja. You might remember this ninja only for a short period of time, as afterwards you might tend to forget it. Obviously this is just one word, so you can remember it for a longer time, but if the number of words increase and the sentences start to increase, it'll become really hard for you to keep this in your mind. Now instead, if I ask you to remember a ninja is sitting on your bed and having a talk with you, it will be really easy for you to remember for a very long time. If I ask you to remember a waterfall, it might be easy for you to remember but not for so long. Instead, if I ask you to imagine the same waterfall on your bed, you can imagine your bed getting wet because of the waterfall and you are not able to sleep on it. This is how the memory palace technique works. Essentially, all the letter pairs, for example say NJ for me was ninja and WF was waterfall. So whenever you get any letter pairs, you just need to start associating those things in the specific locations in your room. A single location is called locus, and a combination of different locus is called a loci. So for example, if I give you a list of letter pairs, say PD, GO, BE, it can be really hard for you to remember it in your long-term memory, and this is where we use the memory palace technique. PD for me is pad, GO for me is gorilla, and BE for me is belt. So I'll imagine a scene that's happening on my table. I'll imagine that on my table I've kept a pad on which there's a gorilla standing wearing a belt. So this becomes super simple to remember. So if I know that all the data I store on this table is for my second cube out of all the number of cubes you're attempting, I can just imagine the whole scene happening on the table. That was, there was a pad on which there was a gorilla standing and he was wearing a belt. So you know that you need to execute in the following order: PD, GO, BE. As simple as that. There will be an example at the end, so make sure you watch till the end of the video if you're having any confusions with this. The main advantage with this method is that you can use even the silliest objects present in your room to remember a single part of the cube. For example, my room has a bed, 2 tables, a cupboard and another table. So I can use all those locations to remember a certain part of the cube. Usually top speed cubers use 1 locus for edges and 1 locus for corners. Some people also use 2 locus for edges and 1 locus for the corners. So to remember the data of my first cube, all I do is remember 8 letters on my bed, 4 letters on the table. So I'm done with 12 edges, and the remaining 8 letters that I get for corners, I store them on another table of mine. Obviously this number is likely to change. You might have some fewer number of edges or more number of edges, and the same goes for corners, but usually this is kind of the average number, and that is the reason I chose these numbers. So whenever I finish memorizing all of my cubes and I go back to my first cube to execute all the algorithms required, I just need to start off memorizing that I'm on my bed and need to remember what all was happening on my bed. Once I finish all the 8 letters on the bed, I can proceed to my table and know what all was happening over there. So if I had pad, gorilla and belt on the table, I knew I had to do PD, GO and BE. One mistake that many people do with such sort of a method is that they imagine things oddly standing on the table. Let us take the gorilla and belt for example. Instead of just imagining that there's a gorilla who's wearing a belt, you can imagine that there's a gorilla who's picking up a belt and ready to wear it. So it is not necessary for you to make sure that the objects are interacting with each other, but make sure that the first object at least should interact some way or the other with the locus you have, and the remaining objects need to interact with the first object. The more weird you think or the more creative you think, the better it will be in your memory. So try thinking in a way that you might not use in a real life, but just for the purpose of memorizing a cube, that works completely fine. Usually for single blind, we start off memorizing corners, memorizing edges, executing edges and executing corners. But for multi-blind, I personally use a different order. I memorize my edges first, I then memorize my corners, I then execute my edges and I execute my corners. The reason I do this is because I know in my room which order all my objects lie in. So say for example, if my table comes before my bed, I know that the table should contain data for edges. Because if my table contains data for corners, I'll have to go one step ahead, that is to my bed, do all the respective algorithms that I stored on the bed and then get back to the table, do everything I had in for corners and then go 2 steps forward to the next location. Instead, if I have the table as my first location, I can first do everything on my table, sequentially go to the bed, go to another table and so on. This can obviously vary for you. If you don't feel this is comfortable, do what you feel is comfortable and not just what I said. Every people have different comfort zones, so make sure you find yours. Alright, so I'll leave the scramble down in the description box if you want to follow along. I'll be using a 2D representation of my room to show you how I would go about storing the data I remember. I'll do this only for one cube, but if you still have any more doubts and if you don't understand anything, always feel free to ask me down in the comment section. So let's get started. Alright, so my first room is always my bedroom, and in that the first locus will be my bed. The second locus will be a table and the third locus will be another table. So I'll be remembering 4 letter pairs or 8 letters on my bed, the rest of the edges on one of the tables and 8 corners on another one of my table. So I hold my cube green front and white top, and this is gonna be my buffer piece. So let us start by taking a look where this needs to go. This goes right here, that is the letter D. And this goes here, that is the letter C. And because C is second in the letter pair, I'll be switching it to W instead. And if you're not able to follow along, please make sure you know the M2 method, because for edges I'll be using the M2 method. This method works even if you use old Pokemon, but because M2 is a bit faster, I would recommend that you learn that also. So for me, D and W stand for dwarf. So on my bed, I'll imagine that there's a dwarf person. This goes over here, that is the letter H. This goes over here, that is the letter F. So for me, HF stands for half. So I'll imagine that there's a dwarf person who is half the height of mine. This goes back to the buffer, so I'll have to start a new cycle. Since I haven't gone to this piece, I'll start with the letter B. B needs to go right here, and that is the letter S. But again, since S comes second in the letter pair, I'll be switching it over to I. BI for me is bird. This letter goes right here, that is the letter P. This goes over here, that is letter V. So I'll imagine that there's a bird which is pole vaulting. So now that I'm done with 4 letter pairs, I'm gonna stop memorizing everything on my bed and switch over to the table. So how would I make a story with all of these? Well, I'll imagine that there's a dwarf person who is half the height of mine and sitting on my bed, and he suddenly sees a bird which is pole vaulting and trying to enter the room through the window. Since this is something that you don't see in your everyday life, this will be really easy for you to remember. Now I'll switch over to my table. So we ended right here. This needs to go here, that is the letter X. This needs to go right here, that is the letter N. XN for me is electrocuted nightingale. This goes here, that is the letter A, and this goes back over here, that is the letter M. And because it has reached where we had started our new cycle from, I stopped memorizing once again. And since I've been to all the edges, I know that I can now stop memorizing the edges part. So XN is electrocuted nightingale and AM is ambulance. So how I would imagine this is I would imagine that there's a dead nightingale lying on my table, and the bird that had pole vaulted and entered my room, the reason behind the bird entering my room was because it had called ambulance as the nightingale was its friend. So for the edges, the final memorization would go like this. There's a dwarf person who is half the height of mine, and he sees a bird doing a pole vault and entering the room through a window. The reason behind it is because he had his friend, the nightingale, who was lying dead, and he wanted to save his life, so he called an ambulance. This is super simple to remember, and I guarantee you, even if you watch till the end of the video, you won't forget this statement. And if you can remember this, that's really awesome, because then you are almost ready for multiblind. And in case you do forget this, that's pretty fine, because this story was made in my way. For example, DW might not necessarily be dwarf for you, it might be anything else. So you need to optimize your letter pairs, come up with what you feel is more convenient for you, and then just go on connecting it in some weird way or some creative way. Just try to keep the story distinct from each other. I don't want to have the same story kind of thing going on even on my bed and even on my table. And in this example, I did connect my story from bed to table, but that is not necessary. In fact, you don't need to do that at all. Just because I had an opportunity, I didn't want to miss it, and I did end up connecting them. Now that I'm done with the edges, I can proceed to corners. This is gonna be a buffer sticker. This goes right here. That is the letter D. This one needs to go right here. That is the letter H. DH for me is dough. This one needs to go right here. That is the letter K. This one needs to go right here. That is the letter G. This goes back to the buffer so I can stop memorizing and start a new cycle. So now as you can see, there are only 2 more corners remaining, and these are actually solved but they're just twisted. So for such cases, what I do is I switch back to how I originally started naming the cube and see the top and bottom sides. For me, that is white and yellow. So in this case, I'll memorize where the white or yellow stickers need to go. So for example, this is the letter N, and we have this over here, that is the letter T. But if I just memorize NT, it might be confusing as you don't know if you actually need to do the swapping algorithms for NT or you just need to do the flipping algorithms for those. So what I do is I imagine that thing getting twisted. So what I'll do is I'll imagine that there's 1 kg of dough kept on my table, which is inside a net, and some naughty kid came and threw the net away. So essentially all the content in it was also thrown away. So whenever I reach my table for solving the corners, I'll know that I'll have dough and kg, and because everything was thrown away, that is the last thing, net was twisting all around. So I'll know that one of my white sticker is on N and the other yellow sticker will be on T. I won't be showing you the execution part as that remains exactly the same, just how you would do for your normal blind solve. So I hope you guys found this tutorial helpful. If you did, please make sure to leave a like, comment, share and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And if you have any doubt, no matter how silly, how small, how big, how serious it is, please make sure you leave it in the comment section so that I can get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you so much for watching the video till the end. You guys rock, take care of yourselves and have an amazing time ahead.